On today's World Insight, missiles hit Kiev while UN Secretary-General Guterres was meeting Zelensky. Are there any international actors left that can mediate the conflict?
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has arrived in Ukraine. He's set to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday. On Tuesday, he met Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. There, Guterres repeated calls for both Russia and Ukraine to guard safe and effective humanitarian corridors in Ukraine. Mr. Putin told the UN chief there's still hope for negotiations to end the conflict, and Russia did not reject talks. So how could the UN make efforts to bring peace to the region? How much does the UN matter today on this issue? To bring more answers, let's talk to our panelists. Latest for the crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined in Karlovy Vary, Peter Dickinson, who is the editor for the Atlantic Council on Ukraine Alert. Meanwhile, he's also the publisher of the Business Ukraine magazine and Lviv Today. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, a Russian political and defense analyst. Last but not least, in Shanghai, Zhao Long, who is professor from the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies with Shanghai Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. The United Nations Secretary-General made a trip to the region. Now, to you, Mr. Dickinson, what is the most important message he has got?
Hi. To be honest, I think it was quite a low-key visit in terms of results. I don't think it achieved much. I think his message was a very broad message regarding the need for peace, of course, which I think is fairly universally shared. He was quite outspoken in the horrors of the conflict and the need for a resolution of some kind, but he didn't offer any specifics in terms of how that could be achieved. So I think that most of the any hopes there may have been prior to his visit were for some specific advances in areas such as humanitarian corridors, perhaps humanitarian relief, aid for those who find themselves in the war zone or displaced by the conflict or even under occupation. We didn't see a lot of that. And frankly speaking, I think yesterday's missile attacks on Kiev by Russia while the Secretary General was in the Ukrainian capital spoke volumes about the effectiveness of his visit. In other words, it was not very effective at all, unfortunately.
Mr. Felgenhauer, your thoughts?
Well, Moscow is not very happy with the UN and specifically with the Secretary General. There have been some even public protests from the Russian diplomats, from the Kremlin, that he's overstepping his authorities and that he's not impartial. So apparently it was even some issue to actually receive him. And understand that the meeting in the Kremlin didn't go very well. There was some specific kind of talk about finding some kind of deal to end the siege in Mariupol, to get the civilians out, maybe by sea, using UN kind of good intermediary officers, or something happening there to resolve that situation. Apparently it did not then happen. So yes, it was not very result of mission, and Moscow does not actually believe that the Secretary General is totally impartial.
Mr. Zhao, of course, there was a lot of debate about whether the Security Council voting system was appropriate. So the UN Secretary General's visit there also reflects a lot of different debates behind the scenes. Your take?
Well, I think even with very limited expectations, Mr. Secretary General's visit to Russia and Ukraine demonstrated the widening gap between the current situation and substantive negotiation process. Well, it should be noted that there's still diplomatic way out, but neither side has refused to negotiate, but the willingness to compromise is extremely limited. Both countries believe that the situation on the battlefield is beneficial to themselves and hope to determine the final solution by winning or losing on the battlefield. So I think that's why, explained why when during his visit, the Moscow still launched the missile attack on Kyiv. So that means maybe his visit was not as much as expected by both sides.
There is a direct quote of the United Secretary-General in an interview later after his visit to Russia. He has been talking to various media. Here's one of those quotes. It was possible to tell President Putin the same thing I say in New York, he said, or I will be able to say here in Kiev, which means the Russian invasion, quote unquote, is against the Charter of the United Nations, is violation of territorial integrity of Ukraine, and that is war must end as quickly as possible, end of quote. Now, that is, of course, an interview he did later after visiting Russia. Very useful, the meeting with Russian president. Now, we understand this war is likely to go on for some time, but Mr. Pavel Felgenhauer, given what is going on the battleground, how much do you see the United Nations still carry its weight and also its role both as a mediator and as a humanitarian force?
Well, actually, right now, there's not much role on the ground for the United Nations. They're not very present there much, and they're not doing much at all. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which is also a kind of absolute intermediary in such war situations, has more representation on the ground, but also their achievements are rather limited. Right now, it's not kind of a very friendly environment, and OSCE was just simply pushed out of there. So it's Russia is not believes that it has been unjustly ostracized by the international community and doesn't trust much international bodies, including the UN and the Red Cross International Committee.
Mr. Dickinson, tell me more about how much do you see the role of the United Nations at this moment on the two fronts I just mentioned?
It's difficult to see a direct role. I think that the nature of the current conflict has to a significant degree exposed the limitations of the United Nations as an international body for resolving major conflicts. So the UN, of course, was established in the aftermath of World War II specifically to address major wars, to prevent them from happening. We now see the limitations of that, the fact that it's really quite unable to do so. In the past, the UN has been more effective when dealing with less influential countries, certainly in parts of Africa, in the Balkans to a degree. But when it comes to a permanent member of the Security Council like Russia, the UN really is toothless, has no real leverage there, and Russia is able to block any effective efforts to impose a peace, as it were, on the situation. So I think really that at this stage, the UN's role has been reduced to a humanitarian level, that they may be able to make some sort of breakthroughs on a localized basis in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, and my colleagues have mentioned, humanitarian corridors, evacuations, care for refugees, the human rights issues in occupied parts of Ukraine, and also the growing issue of forced deportations of Ukrainians to Russia. These are all areas where the United Nations might be able to have some sort of influence. But I think in terms of brokering a peace, of ending the war, I think that the options, the possibilities are very slim.
China is one of the P5, of course. Mr. Zhao, how do you see the same question?
Well, I think, unfortunately, so far, the UN has played quite no significant role in peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, and leaving other actors such as Turkey and Israel to guide the discussion. But I think the Secretary General cannot, of course, predict when and under what circumstances that there will be opportunity for the compromise. But at least I think the UN could offer some ideas and provide some platform for the direct dialogue between the two leaders, between the high officials of two countries, and even to appoint some personal envoy of the Secretary General and to coordinate such current, the conflict. But again, from the actual effect, UN can only play as a dialogue promoter at current stage rather than a real peacemaker, in my opinion.
Now let's talk about the next step. Since the UN is playing relatively limited role according to the three of you, what about the current step? What do you think are some of the options besides the military conflict? Mr. Falkenhauer.
Well, there are continued contacts between Kiev and Moscow. As President Putin also mentioned, Moscow believed that there was some progress at the meeting organized by the Turkish President Recep Erdogan in Istanbul, but then Ukraine backtracked. That's the Russian interpretation. Turkey has been active, again, promoting itself as a venue and intermediary. But the problem, of course, is that, the two sides are in contact. The real problem is that their real positions are miles apart. And Turkey, of course, has some leverage over both Ukraine and Ukraine and Russia, but it's a limited leverage. They cannot dictate to Ukraine what to do, and even less so, they cannot dictate to Russia what to do. The Russia, of course, also depends on Turkey, but not in that good enough for Turkey to be inside NATO and at the same time good with Moscow, but not enough for Turkey to kind of put any kind of significant pressure on Russia to change its position.
There's always room for diplomacy, and diplomacy is continuing. Talks will continue. The contacts remain in place, and this is the nature of all conflicts. That the diplomatic backtrack is part of the engagement. But at present, there looks to be very, very slim opportunities for progress. There's very little middle ground between the two sides. There is a perception in Ukraine that the country is fighting for its life, is facing an existential threat that they must address. Otherwise, there is a very real danger that Ukraine will lose its independence and perhaps also its statehood. So there is a sense that they cannot afford to make too many compromises. And there's added to that as well, the initial successes Ukraine enjoyed on the battlefield have encouraged many people in Kiev to think that they can dream the undreamable perhaps a few months ago of actually achieving success. So they're less inclined to go for that. And I think in Russia, the opposite is true, that the Russians now feel that they have no opportunity but to go forward. So we've got two sides who are actually becoming more deeply entrenched at this stage.
How much is the diplomatic front looking like? Mr. Zhao, we see that China, for example, as one of the P5 and also a member of the United Nations, together with others, try to be quote unquote neutral. And yet at this time, it is very difficult to be quote unquote neutral. China has been asked by many to be on one side or on the other. So how do you see this in a way, the current realities countries trying to be neutral are facing today?
Well, I think it's becoming more and more difficult to remain neutral at this point, at this current conflict. But on the conflict resolving process, China obviously chose a quite different strategic thinking compared with some Western countries by providing weapons, arms, and etc. Because China, for example, President Xi just latest proposed the Global Security Initiative, which calling for a more comprehensive, more inclusive dialogue with all parties, and emphasizing on the not just opposing some unilateralism or group politics, bloc confrontation, but also to take the legitimate concern of security concern of all parties and uphold the principles of indivisible security. And in the meantime, China also calling for abiding the purpose and principles of the UN Charter. So you can see that China is clearly playing some neutral status, but this kind of neutral status has more constructive meaning, and it's more, I would say, compatible with the concerns of all parties. I think this kind of a new initiative, a global security initiative, could be the very basis for the further peace talks and the negotiations carried by all parties.
Now, let's move on to talk about some of the other issues related to the Russian-Ukraine crisis, the energy crisis, the food crisis. How do you see both sides of the conflict are trying to address these issues directly or indirectly, Mr. Felgenhauer?
Well, in Moscow, it's believed that Europe cannot do without Russian gas. So Russia has been kind of, President Putin has announced an initiative that if the Europeans want Russian natural gas, they'll have to pay in rubles, a kind of elaborate scheme of them paying in currency, then currency being transformed into rubles in Moscow and then paid to Gazprom in rubles. That's basically putting pressure on Europe to recognize that they can do without Russian gas and that they should modify their positions. And apparently also that they were hoping that there's going to be serious breaks within the European bloc. It's a big bloc of different countries with different issues and different many of them rely to bigger or to lesser or a bigger extent on Russian gas supplies. So this pressure should bring cracks into the European Union, hopefully. That's what right now is happening. Russian supplies of gas are still coming into Europe. So it's more about what's going to be in the future, because now comes summer and Europe does not really need all that Russian gas. The real problems will begin next winter. And now they have to store some supplies from Russia for that winter. Will that happen or not is not clear. In Europe, there are moves to actually cut down the reliance on Russian gas and oil, to stop importing Russian oil and gas, and put pressure on Russia financially, that they would not be able to finance its policy and the country and the war effort. So right now, both sides are also rather belligerent. They hope that the other side is going to cave in. I don't think that either side right now is ready to fully cave in. So it's a kind of war on the ground and war on gas and war on oil. It's a war and war all over.
Mr. Dickinson.
Yeah, I think the energy front is a key front in this conflict. It is the engine of the Russian economy, so it's the engine of the Russian war machine. And that's understood very well in Kiev. Certainly, it's also understood in European capitals. There has been a lot of resistance to imposing decisive embargoes on Russian energy, but there seems to be movement in that direction now. There seems to be more of a willingness to get a bit tougher with Russian energy now, but it's going to take time. Switching Europe's energy strategy away from its current very heavy dependence on Russia is a matter of years, probably, months, certainly, probably years. It cannot be something that it's not a switch that can simply be flicked. So that's going to take a long time. I think that we may see big changes in that direction, but they may not be soon enough to have a decisive impact on the current war. Now, the other issue you mentioned was agriculture, food security. Now, both Ukraine and Russia are major global food suppliers. The Ukrainian situation in particular is desperate now because the country's ports are blockaded. Odessa and other ports on the Black Sea in the south are the main gateway for Ukrainian exports to global markets. They provide a lot of the basic commodities, grains. So Ukraine at the moment is desperately looking for different options of how to maintain at least a degree of its exports. One of the options yesterday, we had the Bulgarian Prime Minister in Kiev. He offered to make the Bulgarian Black Sea port of Varna available to Ukraine in order to export via that port. Now, that's obviously a welcome move for Kiev and good news for global security, food security, but it's limited. The train network in Ukraine is limited. It cannot take as much grain as is needed. So we will inevitably this summer see the knock-on effects of that around the world. There's going to be food shortages.
Mr. Zhao, please, also your analysis.
Well, I think I agree with that. The energy issue would seriously affect the synergy between the U.S. and Europe on sanctions against Russia, and how to properly handle the conflict between the national interest and the coordination among allies. It's quite challenging for the transatlantic relations in the future. And also, I think the quite unique resource and the trade structure of Russia give them quite a significant opportunity to have a strong self-supply capability of energy, food, and industry to ensure some kind of internal economic circle under basic operation. So I think in the future, Russia can also create a more shortage panic in global commodity markets, from energy to the food and to other commodity prices, and to mediate the economic losses caused by sanctions. So I think the recent rebound of Russia's foreign exchange market and stock market also proves the effectiveness of relevant countermeasures. So I think Russia has a quite strong comprehensive ability to withstand the pressure, and quite difficult with those sanctions to destroy Russia's willingness to achieve its strategic goal in Ukraine.
Meanwhile, how do you see there is another issue? It seems that the diplomacy, quote unquote, coming from Kiev has been quite successful. The president has been pretty much on the front line in terms of diplomacy, talking to world leaders, talking to different parliaments, asking for military support and asking for what he considers as the legitimacy of his government and many other issues against Russia. Now, Mr. Dickinson, has that strategy been a good strategy from Kiev's perspective?
Well, I think President Zelensky certainly has played a very prominent role in Ukraine's efforts to consolidate support for the country. I think the first thing that's important to notice is that Zelensky stayed in Kiev. When the war began, there were expectations of a very quick Russian victory, and Ukraine's partners offered Zelensky the opportunity to be evacuated, to leave, to maybe set up a government in exile. He said no, and he stayed, which was a very important symbolic step. Since then, he's been very prominent in his, as you mentioned, in his appeals to the different parliaments around the world. It's difficult to keep track how many parliaments he's spoken to. In fact, I think he's addressed dozens. We're now starting to see the results of that. We have the Lend-Lease agreement yesterday agreed in America, multi-billion-dollar package coming through. A number of other countries now are saying, yes, we will provide heavy weapons to Ukraine. Initially, the weapons coming to Ukraine were largely handheld, small-scale weapons, the sort of things that you would use to fight an insurgency. Now, what we're seeing is a very significant shift to tanks, artillery, rocket systems, and possibly even soon jet planes. So I think this had a big impact. I think he's performed better than a lot of people, frankly speaking, in Ukraine would have expected. But still, his requests continue. He wants more.
Yeah. On the Russian side, though, Mr. Felgenhauer, how is Russia digesting all of the latest changes? The world leaders, especially those from the West, visited to Kiev, and also further sanctions against Russia, various international organizations punishing Russia though Russia itself volunteers to withdraw from many international organizations. So how is Moscow trying to digest all of this latest?
Well, the Kremlin is very successful in internally bringing its message, and the Russian public, the Russian people of different nationality support massively the Kremlin and its efforts in Ukraine. But internationally, yes, it was and is a terrific failure. And Russia sees itself as isolated and ostracized. That actually helps to some extent to get across the message inside the country that Russia is being ostracized and everyone's against us and we should unite. That works internally, but externally it doesn't work at all. Russia is indeed ostracized, and that is very dangerous because it's a complicated world, and Russia depends very much on this world for running the country, and that may be running short, and that could be a very serious material problem, not just simply a disappointment that you're not seen well in the public opinion of the West.
Final question about the various European countries' desire to discuss at least and even further to join NATO. Mr. Zhao, what is your take on the latest development?
Well, the Finland and Sweden are having a very comprehensive discussion about joining NATO. I think this is one of the negative effects of the prolonged conflict between Russia and Ukraine, because at the beginning, the strategic intention of Russia was to stop the easternward expansion of NATO. But turns out that the result could be the much more comprehensive and accelerated expansion of the NATO in the future. So I think this is not good news, and there will be any factors to be viewed for Russia as the factor of escalating the situation. And of course, Russia will to enhance its military capabilities in the border between Russia and Finland. So I don't think this will bring some future or bright future of the negotiation process, and they will be accepted by Russia as a very negative factor.
Well, Zhao Long, Peter Dickinson, and Pavel Falkenhauer, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Really appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.